Wow. 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 Wow.
Wow, this PS5 HDMI port is destroyed, but don't worry, I can fix it. What's up everybody, this is Jesse from BCC Board Repairs, back with another video, and today I'm going to show you how to disassemble this PS5 and how to replace the HDMI port. So make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to be notified for future videos. And if you can micro solder or you fix phones all day, every day, go to merch.bccboardrepairs.com and get yourself a shirt. I'll have that link down below in the description. So let's go ahead and get started with the video. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is take off this side covers. Pretty simple, just pull up on the top corner and push this way towards the bottom. Flip it over. And then same thing. And then here on this back side, there's a few screws, so let's take those off. I have an electric screwdriver here using a T9 bit. And then the next screw is right here. Right, and then you can use a dry erase board to label your screws. Flip it over. Then we're going to take off some of these panels. So this one covers up these cables. And then we have this plastic panel here. And slide it out. Then let's do this security screw here. So you want to peel this up. And then we've exposed all the screws, so let's go ahead and remove all those from around the outside. Now one thing you notice is there's some triangles here with different looking, so there's a dark small one, an outline one, and I believe there's another one over here that is different, so that helps you keep track of which screws go where. So I try to lay out the screws on how I found them. Then we have a screw here. This is a regular Phillips head screw. This is where I believe the SSD upgrade will go in. Okay, and then let's take off this fan as well. And we have this cable here that we have to remove. So you try to get the white part and see if you can wiggle it out. That's for this. Let's do this side. So you want to be careful not to pull too hard on the cables, so I'm using my tweezers to help me wiggle this out. This side as well. This one comes off too. Yeah. So we have one here. There you go. All right, so now you have to take out this cable. So you push down and you wiggle it out. And you could release this glue here. And then this drive comes off. All right, so now we gotta take off this heatsink. It is a ton of screws. But there is one thing to note is there's some slots or some holes that don't have screws. So what you can do is use a marker to mark those so that you don't, when you're reassembling, you don't put screws back in. You can see they're everywhere. And then we also have a black screw here. So we want to have a different color Sharpie for this. So let's remove these antennas. So you want to pry up with the metal part where you won't damage the cable. Now the sticker doesn't really matter, it just kind of holds the cable in place. Okay, here's another antenna. And then this cable just slides right out. There's also one here as well. I believe that's it. So now we're gonna take off all these screws, and what I like to do is put a magnet mat here in the center. That way I could quickly just pop them on there. All right, so move this out of the way. Then you pry up on the metal piece. As long as I got all the screws out, you should be able to separate this. If you feel any resistance, you might want to double check that there are no screws left behind. There it goes. So basically it was stuck to these thermal pads, so that's why it was a little difficult to remove. And then we have this CPU clamp or APU clamp. So use a regular Phillips head and loosen this up. And then what I'm going to do is mark this side, just so I don't forget. And then this just comes right off. So these go the opposites from each other, and I believe that's it here. So now we want to lift up the board I'm gonna pop off this board here. Oh, there's one more cable here we wanna remove. So push down and pull out. I think that's it. All right, same thing. We wanna gently kind of wiggle this out. Just double check there's no hidden screws that you might have missed. Wiggle it off. There it goes. And it's off. So, one thing to be aware of is there's this thing called liquid metal, which is a thermal paste for the CPU or APU, and you don't want to mess with this. You want to leave it, the factory stuff, and then when you put it back, just press it back together. So this, just leave it, and then this, what I like to do is get one of these little baggies, and essentially I use it as a little cover. So this doesn't actually touch it, but it's just enough so that you don't accidentally smear your hand on it, and then you're gonna ruin everything. So, but yeah, that's what you should do. And then we wanna go to solder this HDMI port. Okay, so the soldering portion of this video, one important thing I wanna show you guys is I'm gonna use some solder wick, a lot of it. We're gonna use some Kester. This is 6337 soldering wire. This is rosin core, so there's like built-in like rosin, which is basically like flux, into the solder wire, which makes soldering super easy. This is about 183 Celsius melting point. Then we have our 138 super low melt solder wire. This is not rosin core, so you got to use a lot of flux when you're using this. Also, of course, some Amtech flux. Make sure you get authentic stuff. I'll have everything linked down below in the description, but specifically Amtech, I get it from Injured Gadgets, and they get it directly from Amtech. So there's that. You want to be careful with, there's a lot of fakes out there. And then here's the board. Then one last thing is also beneath my bench, I have a separate hot air station just for these jobs, so that I'm able to heat the board from the underside. This makes taking off these HDMI ports and putting them on super easy, and very little risk of melting the plastic on the HDMI port itself. The first thing we want to do is we want to basically prep the pads or tin, everything around here. This makes it so we could remove the HDMI port super easy. So you add flux everywhere. And then what we're gonna do is add some of the low melt 138 solder. I do have some already here ready for me. And I'm gonna use one of my larger iron tips for the job. I normally have a smaller iron tip, but this one is larger, so it transfers heat a lot easier. My soldering iron is set to 750 Fahrenheit. And then essentially, I'm going to try to feed it to all the anchors. One thing you can do is use hot air at the same time you're trying to do this, in case the heat is not transferring. Like if your solder doesn't flow into like a liquid when you're doing this, then there's not enough heat being provided by your iron. So that will make it a lot difficult. I think that's the biggest thing everyone struggles with when you're doing these jobs. Even I struggle with this sometimes, so let me move things around. You want to be careful when you're working on this board. There's small components everywhere. There's small components everywhere, and you don't want to like break stuff, like especially like in the black or the bottom. Add more solder. So right now we're just adding a bunch of solder to everything. That way overall it lowers the melting point of everything. The solder from the factory is high temp, meaning it takes a higher temperature for it to melt. When you mix in your own solder as lower temp, they combine and then create a lower overall temperature. It won't be, for example, this solder I'm using right now is 138, but it won't be, doesn't mean everything's gonna turn into 138 Celsius. It'll just be lower than the factory solder, which whatever that is. So I'm just moving the board around. So right now is when that little plastic baggie comes in handy, because I accidentally rubbed my arm on that liquid metal. Nothing will happen. All right. Now it's time to remove the port. So what I do is actually I hold the actual HDMI port off the edge of my bench. I get my hot air wand from underneath the bench. As you can see, I have no nozzle. And then make sure you take out the little foam thing here from the bottom before you do this. Otherwise you'll burn it. And essentially just hold it directly underneath, and then have some tweezers ready so you can start trying to wiggle it off. The important thing here is you don't want to use any kind of force. The solder should melt, and that should allow you to just come off. You shouldn't have to yank it off. If you're having to yank it off, then you're not doing it right. It has not melted. It only takes maybe 30 seconds to a minute. So you can move the nozzle left to right so it can kind of get every pad. There it goes. See, it just came right off. And you can see no rip pads. Also, if you look at the damage of the HDMI port, someone really messed up here, so good times. All right, so one of the things I like to do here is, well, first let me run some solder over everything. So right now I'm going to use the 183 solder, the Kester. I'm going to tin all the pads. This is just so it makes the wicking part easier. Add a little more flux. Now, there is a technique where you just slap on the new HDMI port on top, although I haven't mastered that yet, so I'm not gonna try it. I'll just stick to the kind of slightly modified version of that, where I'm gonna wick the anchor holes, put the HDMI port on top, so that the pins in the middle, they'll solder onto the pins, and then I'll just manually solder the anchor holes, and then it'll be done. So first, let me wick off the existing anchor hole solder. Now this is a technique I learned from Ben Rosso from ProFixer, so shout out to him. And what I'm gonna do is kind of the same technique. I'm gonna put a piece of wick over the anchor holes, heat it from the bottom, and use my iron to essentially do the scrubbing, which will suck up the solder. All right. Look at that. Clear that out. Now this solder wick is full of solder, so need to get another piece. Let me add some flux here. All right, we'll put that piece there, get rid of this one. And same process, feed it from the bottom. Like that. Our next step is to clean off all this old flux because it has had a lot of heat, so it's gonna kind of burn and be all sticky. You don't want that. It makes it harder to solder with. I'm gonna get my little clean cloth and just wipe it down by hand. I'm using isopropyl alcohol here with 99%. And this softens the flux and makes it easy to clean. Now you can see all the pins are good. So let me put the board aside and now let's prep the replacement HDMI port. So this is, I would think this is a critical part here, is we want to tin all these pins so it's easy to solder. So the solder from these pins mixes with the solder of the other pins and makes it easy to install. So first is we add some flux. Now if you want, you can use a tool like the eye pinch to hold the HDMI port for you. Let me hold it like this. All right. Then I'm gonna use my micro pencil here and my Kester 183 solder, 10 each pin. And so the goal is to have solder on the legs. The key here is also to have flux, otherwise it doesn't go on each individual pin. So you see how it's bridging? Just kind of pull your iron away and it'll scoop it up. If it doesn't, just add a little bit more flux. That and just keep. There you go. Ideally you want little spikes, that way it has kind of a little bit of solder extending out to, so it kind of grabs onto the pads on the board. If you're trying to do it and it's not spiking out, add some more solder to your iron. That should be good enough. Now I only tin these pins here, the row of pins, not the anchors. So you can see there's like tiny little spikes. I'm gonna add some flux. Now depending on your scenario, this little capacitor here might be damaged, it might be missing. Sometimes the port itself gets shoved in and it breaks off that cap. I don't know the value of the replacement cap, but I do know Injured Gadgets carries it. So if you go to injuredgadgets.com, go to the PS5 category, and you should be able to find it there. I think they sell it in 10 packs. All right, so if we put the HDMI port, you'll see the row of pins line up perfectly. Let me put some extra light here so you guys can see a little better. Let's go ahead and solder this on. So the idea here is you'll have solder on the pins and solder on the board. So when it all melts, it'll just all combine together. and make a solid solder joint. So same thing, 430 Celsius and 90 air, and then just monitor it with your eyes. You can use your tweezers to push down. And if you do this right, you won't have to even solder any of the pins afterwards. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, does this hot air hit my face? It does, but by the time it reaches my face, it's not that hot, so it's fine. It just feels like a warm breeze. So you should start seeing some of the solder melting. And one thing is, you don't want to use low melt solder for these solder joints, because it is kind of weak. So any kind of pressure might break that solder joint. Whereas this solder is a lot more sturdy. All right, so if you push down, you kind of see the solder joints move. So you want to push down and take the hot air away. And the goal is to let the solder joints cool down while still making contact. All right, I think it has cooled down. Now I'm gonna do a visual inspection from the side, make sure this is sitting flat. And it does look flat, so I think we're good. Then I'm gonna tilt this, try to get a better look. Solder joints. I think it looks fine. Now let me rotate it. See if we get another angle. See if it's they're soldered on right. I mean, if you ask me, that looks pretty good to me. So let me hold. This is the tough part. It's trying to hold the board up at this angle while using both your hands. So I'm using my chest right now let's hold it right there. So yeah, they all look soldered on pretty good. So one thing you can do, one thing you should do actually, is poke each pin to see if it moves. Now, if you're not sure if it's soldered on right, I definitely recommend touching up each pin, but this should be good enough. Now we gotta hit the anchors. So that's the ones on the outside edge. This is what holds it in place, provides stability. So I'm gonna use the 183 Kester solder. And just like that. All right, let me rotate the board. Now, I'll be honest, consoles aren't my favorite to repair. I do prefer iPhone repairs, but you know, when you do this job, you get a lot of people who want this repair done, so it's pretty straightforward repair. So if you know how to solder, there's no reason why you pass on this. All right, so I think I got some on this side. Now I'm gonna flip the board over and do the back side. So make sure you hold the little paper baggie or plastic baggie so you don't lose it. Then we're gonna do these anchor holes here. So these are ground, so they take up a lot of heat. It requires a lot of heat to flow the solder, so that's why you see it doesn't even want to solder. You just keep putting pressure. The goal is to transfer the heat. It should be good. Not pretty, but it's functional. Alright, so now clean this up. So now the bottom of the board is grabbing the HDMI port, the top side is also grabbing it. So it should provide a pretty stable, it will provide a stable hold of the HDMI port, so there's no issues into the future. Look at that, the bag is still there. So one last final inspection. Actually, I gotta clean it. All right, let's clean the board. Clean off all of this extra flux. I mean, all the joints are soldered on, so should be good. I got a big blob of solder here. Let's just say that's extra reinforcement. That should be fine. It's all reassembled and ready to test. So let me push the power button. We see the lights, blue lights on. I can hear the disk drive spinning. Now we just cross our fingers and see if it works. Should take only a few seconds to display something on the screen if it's working. Oh, maybe I should turn on the monitor. Can you look at that? It's working. So, pro tip, make sure you turn on the monitor when you're doing this testing so you don't get a mini heart attack. But for now, I think we're good. HDMI port is fixed and it's ready to give it back to the customer. As you can see, this repair is pretty straightforward and really simple. If I could do it, you should be able to do it too. You just have to have enough experience soldering and the right equipment. Some key takeaways I do want to point out is one, don't mix up your screws. There's a lot, so it's super easy to mix up. But if you keep track of them, you should have no issues. Two is when you're removing the HDMI port, make sure all the solder has melted and it comes off easily. You don't want to rip any pads. And three is when you're testing, make sure your monitor is plugged in and powered on. So thanks everyone for joining. Hit that like button if you found this video helpful. Let me know down below in the comments what you thought about it. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Once again, don't forget about our t-shirts at merch.vccboardrepairs.com. Tag me on Instagram if you get one. So I'll see you on the next one.